I'm here today interviewing about admissions with someone very qualified to give us lots of insight on what we can do to make our applications better throughout this next admission cycle. So I'm here today with Christina Chong, who founded the boutique firm Renaissance Admissions Consulting to demystify admissions processes to college, law school, and dental school. She has extensive experience in the field of admissions, having formerly worked as an admissions reader at Harvard Law School and assistant director of JD admissions at NYU School of Law. Christina's expert insights have helped many clients achieve their educational goals for admissions to JD and LLM programs. So thank you so much, Christina, for being here today. We are very, very grateful to have you. So if you could just start off by giving us a little bit of background on what led you to admissions and how you gained this expertise.
Of course. Thank you so much, Leah, for the wonderful introduction. I'm really excited to be back on LSAT Unplugged. I previously was on the show a few years ago with Steve Schwartz, who founded LSAT Unplugged, and it's a real pleasure to be back. So in terms of admissions, my story starts with looking at colleges back when I was in high school. And when I applied to college, the landscape was really different. I had paper applications. You would have them mailed by the college. You would fill it out by hand and use a typewriter, whichever you preferred, and use the post office to send your applications away. And so the landscape was really different, partly because there was just not the internet how it exists today. There was no College Confidential, there was no Reddit. We did not have social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. So there was very limited information about how the process worked. And so I heavily relied on my high school teacher as well as my school's counselor, who worked with several hundred students a year. So it was difficult to kind of get all the information you needed, and they were very, very helpful. But I remember I was applying to a summer program for high school juniors in my state, and my high school had nominated me to be a participant. So I went to a group interview for this program. I was really excited about it. It was a 5-week summer program, and I got to the interview and I was completely unprepared. I had no idea that how to be in an interview. I don't think I had ever had an interview at that point, and there were several other students there. Everybody kind of spoke over each other just to get a word in edgewise with the interviewer, and I don't even think I got a word in. And so afterwards, I was really disappointed because I got a wait list letter, and I thought to myself, okay, I hope they call me. Hopefully they'll call me and let me know I'm off the wait list. I had no idea you're supposed to advocate for yourself and have your teacher or your school, call or write a letter. And, you could write a letter saying you really wanted to go. So that really stuck with me, and I didn't get to attend. But later on, I worked at my college's admissions office and in the undergraduate level. And then I later on went to grad school, where I had the position of reader at Harvard Law School. And later I worked at University of Pennsylvania and various other graduate programs at NYU, including NYU School of Law. So after a good amount of time in admissions, I'm really excited to be working with my own clients for both JD, LLM, dental school, and college. And today we're here especially to talk about JD admissions.
Well, that's all so great. Thank you, Christina. I feel like I have 99 questions I could ask you personally myself after hearing all of that. I definitely wish that, I could have utilized you during my time applying to law school, but definitely in the event that I try to transfer. But with all of that being said, was there something that was the most challenging part or rewarding aspect of being an admissions officer?
There's so many things that were enjoyable about the process, certainly meeting people from all over the world. There's a lot of travel that was involved at the time, going to different campuses. And so I went all around the US. And so that was wonderful, meeting people in person and just getting to talk to students about their dreams. But I think one of the hardest things, in all honesty, with admissions is that you end up not being able to take most applicants. So I think there were times I would read an application, I would think, oh, wow, if only this person had some advice about how to structure their statement or how to present their story. And so in the last few years, I have been working on the other side in terms of consulting, and it's very fulfilling for me to be able to work one-on-one with clients and help them figure out how to tell their stories in a way that really optimizes their chances for admission.
I'm sure I know that as a TA at LSAT Unplugged, it's always nice to hear kids come back and say, oh, I had this score increase. And I'm sure it's really the most joyous thing when, you have your clients come back and tell you, oh, I got into that school that I really wanted to. And, I think that that's really great that you love that part of your job, and like that's why you chose to do this and to be on the other side. I think it takes someone really special to take joy in seeing other people succeed. So the elephant in the room that I'm sure every law school applicant wants to know is, what does it take to stand out among other talented candidates at some of these really high esteemed law schools where you have thousands and thousands of people applying and only 150 students, making the cut?
Yeah, so what I want people to remember is that no story looks the same. And I know it can be a really intimidating process. Certainly there's so much attention on test scores right now, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the program. But so there's a lot of attention to that. Obviously, there's a lot of components, including your recommendations, your essays, and the essay can be super intimidating overall. But I think working with students, think about what makes you special and different. And so when you take a picture of yourself for social media, let's say you want the angles to be really flattering, you want the lighting to be perfect. And so I sort of have my clients do the same thing. So when they're presenting their stories, honestly and accurately, of course, there are ways to state things that really highlight what's special and different. So, what are the experiences you've had in your life? Like, why do you want to be an attorney? That's a really big thing to write about in your statement. They want to understand why law school makes sense in this part of your journey. If you have anything that is unusual, make sure to spell that out, talk about what else that the admissions officer would want to know, but it needs to come together in a way that's comprehensive and is like a story. So when I read a book, there are different chapters. And so the LSAC, has the portal where you fill out your applications. And when the admissions officer is reading it, they're reading it in one sitting. So you want that story to really come through, not be repetitive, highlight different parts. And then, so when they finish reading it, they feel that they have a better understanding of who you are and why you want to go to law school.
Perfect. And just based off of what you said there, I know as a former applicant, when you're talking about reading through maybe what LSAC, through the portal and what they provide, I've always kind of wondered what that looks like. If it's presented to you in the exact way that we see it right before we're going to submit it. I know that on LSAC, I don't believe I can see, for example, my college transcripts on there. Are those detail evaluated? Is it just like we're looking at your cumulative GPA? Do they take a step-by-step look at, have you had an increase in your GPA over your time in undergrad? Have you had a major change? What did that look like? Are those things that are looked at, or is that almost on a circumstantial level? Can you give us any insight on that?
Sure. So I know it seems like you click submit and you're like, wow, what happens on the other end? So you do get on the admissions end, you do get the application that you submitted, as well as the CAS report, which comes through the Law School Admissions Council website. And so in that report, you're going to have all the letters of recommendation, you're going to have all the transcripts that you had from college and classes that you took on the college or grad school level, as well as your test scores, which are currently required for law school admissions. And so it really kind of depends on the individual school and the admissions officer, what they're really looking at most closely. I will say that right now, LSAT or GRE, if they're submitting, does have a big factor, but also grades. I wouldn't say major matters as much as some people think. Their law school has many different types of people that are going and they're going to practice different types of law. So, I don't think the individual major matters so much, but let's say if you're STEM, that is something that's kind of hot right now, to have intellectual property attorneys. But the school, will be looking pretty closely at the test score and the GPA to wonder if that student can succeed at the law school level. And it's not 100% correlation. Certainly it can help. But it's not, there's some unpredictability to this. Of course, like if you can have a really high LSAT and not necessarily do that well in law school for various reasons, but they do look at that. But there's other soft factors that really can stand out. How have you contributed to your college community? Did you have any hardships that you had to overcome? What are the experiences you've had in your life that could really add to the law school classroom? Let's say if you're a veteran or if you've had some, lived all over the world, you have some special talent, et cetera. So all those things are a factor, and there's not, any one thing that will totally make it a shoo-in. You can have a 180, but not necessarily be the ideal candidate. Maybe you didn't do that well in college. And, so there are other factors that play into it, but you have to think about how those factors all come together. And that's what they say when they say holistic admissions. They're looking at how all these different factors come together and what that student themselves can bring to the school. So I wouldn't worry so much individually about what each school wants, because you need to highlight your own story and hope for the best, but hope, at the end of the day, you don't really know if that school's looking for something in particular, but you have the power to control your narrative and also present that story in as engaging way as possible.
So to follow up on that, you kind of touched on, maybe not having the greatest GPA or not having the greatest LSAT score. Does a well-written admissions essay compensate for that? If not that, what does?
Definitely. I do think the personal statement can really help with this. And I have had clients where they weren't necessarily at the medians for test scores, but they had a really engaging and compelling story. They were able to tie everything together in their application, present how they stood out among other applicants. And so in those cases, they didn't get a single rejection. And I think that's pretty impressive. They might've been waitlisted somewhere, but that story in their essay really made it so that the admissions officer and the law school was really excited to add them as a member of their class. And so the personal statement is pretty important. Sometimes, people tend to wait till the last minute, but it's about as important in many ways as other parts of your application, such as the test scores and the GPA, because this is maybe the only chance the law school has to really hear in your own words why you want to go. And occasionally they do have interviews, and we can talk about that later, but a lot of law schools don't interview. So that's probably the one shot you have in order to make your argument and your case for law school.
So I'm glad that you touched on interviews, because I was actually going to go there next and ask what your views are on Zoom informational interviews. Maybe not something that's one-on-one, but where there are hundreds of students across the country joining to kind of learn. Do you think that gives a student an edge up? What are the benefits that an applicant can seek from joining those calls?
Sure. So I know things have really changed a lot in the last few years, and in the past there were more tours and in-person fairs, and certainly some of those are still happening, but it does give access to a lot of people who couldn't necessarily travel to campus and talk to admissions officers in person. So I do find them a great opportunity, especially if there's a school you're really interested in. And I recommend to my clients that they try to join as many of these as possible, just to get a feel for the school itself, what they're looking for, if there are any unanswered questions. I know it can be intimidating because you're thinking, oh, well, what if I say something that's embarrassing in one of these meetings and the admissions officer remembers me? And to be frank, it's really hard to remember an individual applicant unless you really stick out, because admissions officers, by nature of their job, they interact with so many perspectives and applicants. So, they're not necessarily going to remember each individual interaction. So go for it. And there are other ways to also get more information. You can go on their website, you can go to trusted sources like podcasts from admissions experts and talk to your pre-law advisor. But I do recommend that in order to get a sense of which law schools you like and what their personality is like, as well, is to go to these informational interviews if you can, and listen to their webinars, get an understanding if it's a school that you feel you would be excited to attend.
Absolutely. And just to pivot a little bit on the issue of interviews, I've noticed as an applicant for this cycle myself that I haven't come into contact with many schools that have interviews whatsoever. Or if they do, they're online where you're not actually face to face with someone else, like in a Zoom. It's the question is prompted to you and you have 1 or 2 times to answer it within 2 minutes, and then it just automatically submits. Do you have any advice for students looking to prepare to do those? And if that's an optional opportunity, do you, under what circumstances, 100% recommend that they take advantage?
Sure. I know those, I call them robot interviews. Those are some of the hardest to prepare for. And I remember doing one a few years ago, and it's just really hard to get a sense of your timing and how you're doing because there's no human reflecting back at you and interacting. So I do think it's good to do them if they're offered. They give a sense to the school if you're interested. And although, level of interest might not be as big of a factor as it used to be just due to the pandemic, it's not as easy to visit campus, et cetera. And obviously they don't want to disadvantage applicants who aren't able to get to school. But in this case, I would do it if it's offered, if it's a school that you could see yourself attending. It gives the admissions officer a chance to learn more about you in a different format than just your written materials and your transcripts and test scores, and show a bit of your personality. So what's really important about these, and I do prep my clients very carefully, and we practice with the timing. I get a timer out, and it's really good to look up the previous questions that these interviews have asked. And there's tons of online resources that will say, okay, these are some of the ones that came up for this particular school. And then time yourself talking about it. You don't want to sound super rehearsed, of course, but you want to take time to really research the school itself. What's special about it? You don't want to say, oh, I want to go there just because it's the name of this school. They're such a good school. You really want to get into, okay, what kind of law offerings do they have? Is there a particular class or professor you like? Is there a particular club you could join? Do they have a particular internship opportunities? So in a lot of ways, it also gauges your interest in the school and how much research you've done about that particular law school. And so that when the admissions officer does watch it, they get a sense of why you want to go there, and also a little bit more about you as a person that they can't glean from just reading your file.
So for someone who maybe was looking forward to or believed that there were a lot of interviews that you would get for law school and that was like a mandatory part, and maybe it was prior to the pandemic, I'm not sure. But maybe if they had this false sense that was a big important part and they felt like that's where they could shine as opposed to on paper, what advice do you have to them on how to use that energy and personality that they have when they speak into maybe the optional essays? Should all of these students be writing as many optional essays as possible? Is it okay to write 2 of 4 optional essays? What do you think? I know that sometimes I've heard less is more, but is that true here?
Sure. So even before the pandemic, not every law school required an interview. It really depends. At NYU Law, they only offered interviews if you're applying for a particular scholarship. And so they would come to campus and interview, but in other cases, no. I know now they've switched to, if you're waitlisted, then you have an opportunity to do one of those online robot interviews. So, but if you don't even have a chance to do a robot interview, then yes, I do think there are other ways to stand out, but it depends on the law school. So There are law schools that have a lot of prompts. So, University of Pennsylvania is one of them. And, I do recommend that the client, especially if they would love to attend a particular school, write the optional essays. They don't have to write every single one. It's a lot of work. But there are other schools that don't really care so much about, the additional essays. But if it's something that is really in your top 5 or 10, I would go for it and really reflect on what you would bring to the table, their classroom, and one thing I do tell my clients that it needs to be so specific enough that if you tried to change the name of the law school in the essay, you couldn't do it. So let's say if you could exchange NYU law and Columbia law in the same essay and it would still make sense, it's not going to work. You have to go really a deep dive, look into what they offer, what are the certain programs that they have, professors, et cetera. So the student just needs to really take the time to look up how they would contribute to the community in that case.
Thank you for that. I know that some students, I'm not going to exclude myself from that, sometimes like to make the shortcut of copy and paste, take out the name of the school. So don't do that. Moral of, if you learned nothing today, everyone, don't do that.
Don't put the wrong school name either.
Yeah, and don't do that either. I was told that once. If you're going to do it, don't have a separate file for every single one. How early, in your opinion, should an applicant consider preparing for admissions?
Wow. So yes, each student's totally different. I have had those clients that have said, I've wanted to be a lawyer since I saw Legally Blonde, when I was a kid. I knew this was for me. And then there are others that come to it much later. Let's say they've been working and out of college for a while. And so I think the biggest question is, how long will it take you to prepare for the test? That's a big one. You have to decide, is the LSAT better for me? Is the GRE better for me? We'll talk a little bit more about test prep later. But there's also, if you're still in college, there's time, obviously, to really get to know your professors. And so you want strong letters. You want your professors to be able to pick you out of a crowd, like if they saw you on the street. I know that's obviously more challenging these days with, all the situation with remote classes, but, make the effort to go to office hours or, make appointments or do a Zoom meeting and, get to know that professor a little bit more. Joining activities, again, that has been a little challenging in this day and age, but there are other ways to get involved, through volunteering or contributing to causes or founding things, and a lot of things can be done online as well. You don't have to do things in person. So you can start at any point, like when you feel ready. Sometimes students need time to save, and prepare, in terms of the funding, or they have other family obligations. But each individual client's totally different. But if you're in college, I don't think it's ever too early, even as a freshman, to start thinking, okay, which classes will really help me? What kind of internships will I find interesting? What are the professors that can really speak to me as a person and what I bring to the table?
Great. I don't want to talk about COVID too much as we're entering into a new era, but I do want to ask what has changed in the admissions process with the new normal that we have. I know we've kind of talked about interviews and things being online and not being able to maybe tour in person until you're admitted. Do you have any insight that you can provide us on what is different and how to navigate from here on out?
Sure. So what I've seen is a little bit more unpredictability, and certainly it's been a long 2 years for everybody, and it seems that there's just more uncertainty. So when the pandemic first happened, law school applications went way up, and that tends to happen when the job market is a little difficult. So they went way up, and then there was a big change with the LSAT because they switched to the flex version for the first year of the pandemic, which meant that instead of having 5 sections of multiple choice and then doing the essay at another time during the LSAT flex period from 2020 to 2021, the test was only 3 sections, and it was also administered at home. which was a big change because previously you had to go to a test center. When I took it, I had to go to a test center, which I wasn't familiar with, which was far away from my home. And I wasn't even allowed to bring a phone. And my test back then was 5 multiple choice sections plus a writing section all at the same time. Nowadays, you can take the writing section at a different time than the multiple choice section. So I do think in some ways that scores really went up during that time. It's definitely more comfortable to be sitting in your own home instead of going to a test center and then only having 3 sections instead of 5. So that happened. Now we're back to a 4 multiple choice section version that is called still the LSAT, but it's still administered at home. There's no in-person LSAT testing. So it's still a little shorter than the previous version that was before the pandemic. So I do think students felt a little bit more comfortable just not having to have such a grueling long test. You have fewer sections to focus on. And then with admissions, I think certainly there's a lot of pivoting. I think it was more unpredictable for them to tell who was coming and who wasn't coming. So there were more deferrals of students deciding to delay starting law school. So then I thought it also took longer to do things like process the mail, because there wasn't necessarily someone in person opening the mail every day. And it possibly took longer to get a decision because, the committee has to, read the files. And if they do have a group committee meeting, they need to talk about each file. So I think things generally, were slower. It was harder to kind of know where you were in the process because admissions officers, had other commitments too. If you're working at home and, you might have other responsibilities too, like especially if you had children, it's very hard to watch your child and read applications at the same time. So I believe those factors. And of course, with the pandemic, obviously, people were out because they were sick. So there's just a lot of other factors. But I do think that, students might have heard back later in the cycle. And there's more waitlisting going on because colleges and law schools don't want to over enroll their class. So they don't want to have too many students show up because they might not have a room for them. So what I saw on my client end was that it would just take a bit longer to hear how everything shakes out.
And you spoke on a couple things that I bogged some questions for me. One of them being in terms of admissions committees, how they review your application. I guess maybe my assumption was always they all sat at a round table and everything was passed around. And at the end, it was like a vote. Okay, who, yay or nay, right? But is this more on does everyone get individual time? Does all of a committee see an application? Does one individual, make a decision on it? And then with wait lists, are they kind of thrown in the middle and then decided? How does that happen?
Sure. So I'm sure we've seen all these admission movies, like the one with Tina Fey, right? And that's more the traditional college version. Law school is a little different. College admissions offices are huge by nature. They tend to be much bigger than most law schools. So you have, generally a pretty big staff, and they are each assigned a region of the country or the world. And then, they bring people to committee. That's generally how it works in college. Law school, you have smaller numbers than you do in college. Law schools tend to be 100 to 500 people per class, depending on the law school. So how it generally works, not always, is that, the application shows up and then they're divvied up among the staff. And then they're each assigned a certain section. And then in that section, there might be people they recommend for admission. So there might be an internal rating system. And then whether all the people in the admissions office sit down and talk about it, that's up to the admissions office. But generally what happens is that the people who are recommended for admission go through the head of admissions or some other committee through the school. It might include faculty, and then they make the final decision. So in a lot of cases, it's usually the head of admissions. If there are certain special cases, there might be weighing in from, other important people at the law school, like the dean and such. But other law schools are really different. I know Yale Law School, it's really mostly the faculty that do the reviewing, not the admissions staff. So the admissions head might have the ability to recommend a few people for admission directly, but then most of the files actually go through, I think 3 faculty. So they all read it. So Yale is one of the few law schools it doesn't really matter when you apply, because it's not, it's not a disadvantage if you apply close to the deadline. The faculty will read it and then they decide. But in most cases, it works as in the first case, where admissions does have a say in who they think should be admitted, and then the head and of admissions and other people possibly at the law school also weigh it.
So what would you have to say to a student who is nervous to reach out to this admissions office? What would be your advice for them who feel as though they need additional help?
Oh, in terms of just asking questions, or?
Yeah, like if they were just nervous to, I guess, reach out to the admissions office, whether that be, terms of they would remember them or something like along those lines.
Yeah, I would say don't be. They want to be helpful. They're in this business for a reason, and they enjoy interacting. So there's a lot of ways, whether it's email, probably email's easier these days than the phone, because they're not always staffed the same way they were before the pandemic. And then you had asked about the wait list, and that also depends on the school. But I know when I worked in law school admissions, if you had a particular, candidate that kind of stood out on the wait list, then you could kind of say, oh, okay, I think this person might be a good person to possibly take off the wait list if there's space. So they would also kind of gauge your interest in different ways, whether you wrote in additional letters or got another rec. And it depends on the law school very much if they want to do that or not. Some of them might not want all the additional supplementary materials, because obviously it kind of is a lot to sort through, but others do recommend, sending in more stuff, especially if you have additional grades, or, possibly you could do another interview depending on the school. In terms of asking questions, yes, I wouldn't feel intimidated. They're there to help. You might not be interacting with the admissions officer directly. It might be, another staff member. So, ask your question, but do check first if you have it available online on their website, because usually they have a fax page, and they might have other materials that they distribute, whether it's, videos or, informational brochures, but don't feel intimidated. They're there to help. They're not going to single you out, but keep in mind also, don't be so persistent that you're constantly reaching out. Let's say if you're doing it like once a week, that's kind of a lot. But, a couple times, throughout the process, or if there's, waitlist movement in the summer, and it's okay to reach out occasionally.
For someone who may be on the wait list and, they're in this in between of, one thing that I think is the most difficult personally about law school admissions is you get on wait lists and you have to pay deposits to secure a seat, and there's a waiting of, trying to weigh what you're going to do right in the 11th hour. Do you have any advice for a letter of continued interest to a school, or specific things that should be included in that letter, that other than, supplemental materials? Maybe someone like myself has been out of, undergrad for a year now, and I don't have anything else supplemental in terms of grades. Obviously, as you said, you could do another letter of recommendation, but in terms of a letter of continued interest, what do you look for in those?
Sure. And yeah, I think each school obviously has their own method. Some of them, as I said, do want additional materials. Others are, hey, we know you're interested. We'll get back to you if there's room. But yes, follow their directions, kind of hear what they're saying. Some of them will welcome more stuff. So if they do, like a waitlist letter, then yes, take your time to really add anything that wasn't already in your application. Don't repeat what was in your application, but if there's anything new that's happened, did you take an additional class? Send the official transcript through LSAT if you have more grades. Did you win an award? Is there some sort of achievement that has happened? Is there another way to state how much you want to attend the school, and add more material about why you want to go there? So make sure to follow that prompts. And then, if they have additional things like, asking for an interview, definitely take that opportunity. But I know it is super stressful, waiting through the summer. What I try to tell my clients is that, kind of assume you're probably going to, your current law school that you're deposited at. I mean, things can change. So, it is possible you might not get off a wait list, but if you do, it's a very happy surprise. And I have seen people be taken off the wait list all the way up through orientation. So there are cases where you go, I would be at orientation, we'd be making sure that everyone is there. And if they weren't, then yes, there was space in the class. So, I have heard of people turning around after going to one law school and starting at one law school and then, oh, wow, okay, guess what? I'm going over here now. So it happens. But keep in mind the wait list is long. They do have a certain number of people on the wait list, and they are looking for certain things that might be beyond your control, and they're looking to kind of even out the class. So there might be things beyond your control, that they're looking for. Like, are they thinking, okay, we don't have enough males in the class? Or, are we looking for geographic diversity? We need a certain region of the country. It's not quite as important as it is in undergrad, but it can be there. Or are we looking for a certain type of law that they're interested in? So all you can do is hope, but yeah, I try to keep clients busy and think, okay, you're going to go to law school. How exciting is that? So it can happen for sure.
Sure. So based on what you said there, would something like, if we talk about an LSAT addendum, what would be examples when you would advise someone to submit one and when you wouldn't? And maybe if you didn't submit one and you're on a wait list and your LSAT score isn't, what you wanted or doesn't quite meet the median of the school, when would you say to write one of those and submit that maybe as one of those materials to get off of a wait list? I know that was a lot in one question. So
I'm just trying to structure. So I actually don't recommend addenda except for when you actually first apply. I think that if there's anything that you feel needs additional information, then err on the side of caution and submit that addendum. So where does that apply? So certainly if there is like a lower trend in your grades, or if your testing isn't really reflective of your abilities, but keep it brief and to the point. You don't want to have a novel. Have a few sentences and make sure that it's clear what happened so that the admissions committee has an understanding of the context, but you don't want to over explain and be too much information because they do have limited time. They're reading so many applications. You don't want to have so much material that it's a little overwhelming. So brief to the point. And if there are any cases where there's like gaps in your work history, for example, let's say you didn't work for a year, et cetera, then, explain what was going on. Or, if you had any sort of like, family emergency that might have affected, your grades or your performance, then that's totally fair game. So I think the addenda really generally is reserved for just when you're applying. And then when you're waitlisted, just focus more on what they request, which possibly could be a waitlist letter, an additional rec. So just make sure to follow those directions. But the addenda, I do want my students to not make tons of excuses because you don't want it to be a sob story, but you do want to understand the context, and the admissions officer will like to hear that extra information just so that they're not asking questions later and having to wonder, okay, what happened in this 2-year gap when you weren't working? So they don't want to hear, okay, I was eating bonbons and watching Netflix. Obviously, we say, okay, well, due to XYZ, I was doing this and I was doing that. And, sometimes students are even embarrassed to list what kind of jobs they had, and, such as being a server. And that's nothing to be embarrassed about. You were working and you're in customer service capacity, and, that's, they want to see that you're doing something, if possible. So I would not leave off most work experiences. Obviously, speak to a trusted friend about that if you have questions, but I think it's better to show that you're doing something.
That's really great to hear, because I know that sometimes I think individuals think, oh, I shouldn't put that I was a server or I was a bartender on my resume, even just because it has essentially nothing to do with law, right? It wasn't a law internship, so I shouldn't put it on there. And I know that I thought that at one time as well. So thought maybe it was a little bit irrelevant, but it's good to hear that it absolutely is not. So while we're on the topic of the LSAT, although this may be a preliminary question, do you have any thoughts on the ABA no longer recommending standardized testing, such as the LSAT for law school admissions? And how do you think that's going to be translated or implemented in the next cycles?
Yeah, so law school admissions has seen really a ton of changes in the last few years. I never thought that the LSAT would be offered more than 4 times a year. Back when I took it, it was only 4 times a year, only on paper, only in person. So now you take it at home, it's shorter, you can take the essay at a separate time. You can even cancel your first LSAT score ever and be able to see the score first before canceling. That was something that wasn't offered before. And then the GRE, starting in 2016, certain law schools started taking it, and now over 80 law schools take the GRE. And now the ABA has a panel that's recommended that law schools not require a standardized test for admission, which they have always in the past. And so there's still a point that the ABA as a whole needs to see if they're going to adopt this or not. So we're waiting, but it would be a huge change. And law is a little bit of an outlier compared to other types of professional degrees. Business schools don't require that you have to take, their accrediting organizations don't require that they have a standardized test. And same with medical school, they don't require, but a lot of schools still choose to require a test. So it's up to the individual schools to decide if they want to do that. So if ABA decides, oh, you don't have to require a test anymore, I do think it would be a little slow to kind of see how it shakes out. I do think the top law schools would probably still want to see some sort of test score because, there are things on the line like US News rankings, which, obviously a lot of clients pay attention to that. And they do weigh, the LSAT, the median LSAT, and the median GRE in their rankings. But I think over time, probably the lower ranked law schools wouldn't require it so that they can open up their applicant pool. But I do think law as a whole is a little bit risk adverse. And they're not likely to make a huge change, especially for this upcoming cycle. So I do think it could be one of many factors in admissions if a school does still want to see this score or not. And college admissions itself has been really shaken up because a lot of colleges have gone test optional the last couple of years due to the pandemic. And what I've seen for my college clients is that it's really unpredictable without having a test score at all, because it's very hard to compare high schools that are completely different from each other and see how they did. And then to have a national test to kind of see how they compare has been helpful. So it's super unpredictable at the college level. So I think at the law school level, it's possible that there would be more attention to other things like essays and activities like there is at the college level. And I think another complication is law school right now. In order to, take the bar and practice as a lawyer, you do have to pass the bar. So that is a factor. Whereas college, there's many, many different pathways to college, many different majors. There's not one, exam you need to take at the end of college to be like, oh, wow, I need to, practice in this field. So law does, the LSAT, isn't a perfect predictor of how a student's going to do in law school, but it is one factor that helps. And so it is a lot of time and money for a student to go through law school if they're unable to pass the bar and unable to practice. So there are places that kind of have alternative ways to, get through. Like in California, you don't have to go to law school to take the bar, but there are a lot of unaccredited law schools that exist there. And, it is much harder to pass the bar without going to law school. So there's a million factors going on here. We're not sure quite how it's going to shake out, but I do think if it's adopted, probably the top schools will still probably want to see it. Other lower ranked schools might not, require it, but there would be a lot more attention to other factors of admission. And so it could help even the playing field, but then there also might be more attention to, okay, how do I increase my visibility in these other areas? And as of right now, you don't need to be super standout in your activities to get into a top law school.
Well, as we end or near the end of our time together, Christina, I do want to ask just two more questions about maybe non-traditional students or students, looking to maybe transfer from one law school to another if they were, excited to be admitted to law school, but maybe not one of their first choices. What admissions tips can you give to those students who are looking to transfer, and what is the focus of that application from an admissions perspective?
Sure. So for non-traditional students, they're definitely an asset. Each student's really different. I've never seen a story be exactly the same. So there's a lot of ways that a non-traditional student can stand out. Have they had another career? How do they excel in that career? What other life experiences have they had? So I tell them to take advantage, like really highlight what you've done so far. And, you have more experiences than, I know it might be a little harder than an undergrad to have, not necessarily, but you just had more time to build up that resume. In terms of transferring, what's nice about it is that there's really not much emphasis on your standardized test scores at all. They're really looking carefully at more how you did your first year of law school. So that's super important. It's helpful to have a higher GPA. And also it's nice to have a recommendation from a current law school professor to talk about how you've done in law school so far. So it's certainly a simpler process in that way, but there's a lot more unpredictability to it because whether you can transfer also depends on the availability at that law school. There are some law schools that have really big transfer classes, so Columbia and NYU law both have pretty big transfer classes, but other schools don't take that many at all. So you can look at the ABA 509 report. So the American Bar Association regulates that, their accredited law schools make a report every year that's called the 509 report that comes out summarizing the admission statistics for the most recent incoming 1L class. So if you look there, you can get a sense of which law schools students transferred from, how many, et cetera. So that's really helpful information. And then it's also good in your essay to have clear reasons for why you want to transfer. Don't bash your current law school. You want it to sound like, there's a very specific reason. Okay, I want to be in this particular city, or the particular offerings of this school are really perfect for my future in intellectual property law, and then list those reasons. So, always make it into a positive. Don't sound negative about your current situation. But it is a little stressful because the deadlines are all different times, and the schools kind of make decisions at different times as well. So it's possible you would hear, oh, I got into this school in August, and then you kind of have to scramble to, change your plan, find a place to live if you're changing cities. So, and then also if you're interviewing for law firm jobs, a lot of that happens, at the end of 1L. So then there's that stressful period where you're trying to navigate switching schools and getting into their interviews. So just kind of be prepared that it's going to be a little, unpredictable and stressful, but just be ready to kind of get up and go if you are admitted to transfer.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Christina. This has been so helpful to me, who's, myself, as I've already applied and gotten into law school, just learning about, maybe things I could have done differently or things that I can use moving forward to even get off of a wait list or to transfer. And I know that it'll be ultra helpful to those that are applying to law school now for the next cycle. And if we have students that would like to utilize more of your expertise, how can you be reached?
Yes, and congratulations, Leah. That's so exciting about law school. I know you're going to do great. And in order to reach me, I have my website, Renaissance Admissions Consulting, and you can find it at renaissanceadmconsulting.com. So if you have any additional questions, I'm really happy to help answer them. You can contact me on my website.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much again, Christina, for your time this evening. And we all at LSAT Unplugged hope that we get to chat with you again soon.
Thank you so much, Leah. Have a great rest of your day.
You too.
Take care. Bye.